we've spent now about 5 years working not on the report itself, but about developing a vision for probation from the Annie Casey Foundation. And this dates back to a lot of conversations we've had over the years with many of you who are on this today, and others throughout the JDI network. When we've been working in jurisdictions around the country, both in JDAI and in other work, what's been clear for a long time is that probation both played a huge role in juvenile justice reform efforts, and that probation provides a huge opportunity to transform the juvenile justice system, but was also a huge problem in creating many of the circumstances that we see from place to place, the number of young people in out-of-home placement on any given day, the number of young people in detention centers on any given day, and that so many of them were there either directly because of a violation of probation or because of a failed probation experience one way or another. When we looked at ways in which the Casey Foundation could promote changes in frontline practice in the juvenile justice system just generally, the obvious spot to pick was probation. It's where the kids are. And that's really why we're here. Just quickly, I wanna thank Dick Mendel, who was the author of this report, who worked really hand in hand with Steve and also John Cookus over the last couple of years. When we brought Steve to the Casey Foundation, the thing that was really exciting right away was Steve came in with his own vision around probation. And I think we really spent the last couple of years sort of wrestling with one another about what this should look like. And I think this report really gets to the guts of it. The last thing I will say, because I won't steal any of the content of the report itself, I'll let Steve do that, but is that what we're doing today and what I hope will follow in the space on JDI Connect is the very reason why we created JDI Connect in the first place. That this transformation, transforming juvenile probation, that this vision paper is not intended as a practice guide to help move juvenile justice systems one more step to the right or to the left. This is intentionally an effort that we believe takes big leaps for the juvenile justice system, that there are a lot of things that we'll talk about today, whether it's not having diverted youth end up in the formal juvenile justice system, irrespective of whether they violate the terms of diversion, of having diversion live in the community, of having probation violators never end up in placement, of flipping from sanctions to incentives in a much more severe way. All those things, and I said I wasn't going to talk about any of those things, but all those things are stuff that we realize that a lot of people might be nodding their heads right now, I hope, saying yes, yes, but we also know that that's not what's the reality today. And what we hope is that this is the kind of conversation where there will be disagreement, that you'll be raising your hand throughout this webinar today saying, hold on a second. And if we don't do it today, that we'll be doing it in the days, weeks, months ahead on JDI Connect. Again, it's why we created this space. We didn't just create it so that we could just pat each other on the back as we're pursuing things. We created this space as a place for us to grapple with the issues of today and tomorrow. And we believe that the tomorrow for juvenile justice requires a transformed probation. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Nate. Hi, everyone. So before I get into the overview of the paper, I want to just first give a little bit of background about myself and kind of what brings me into this work. I'm a probation guy. Started off my career about 20 years ago as a juvenile probation officer in Pennsylvania. Was school-based probation officer, was a probation supervisor for several years before working at the state and doing state-level policy work around juvenile probation for about 10 or 11 years. But it's been interesting, this journey, since I came to the Casey Foundation and working on transforming juvenile probation, because I find that much of what I learned over the arc of the career, I've kind of discovered way back before I really knew it. So like most who work in probation, when I became a juvenile probation officer, I envisioned myself as being a counselor, a mentor. I really just wanted to be a positive influence on kids. For me, because most of the kids in the system look like me. So I just really sought to help them get off probation and get them on the right path. But the reality was really quite different for me. In reality, I had way too many cases on my caseload. I received way more training on field safety and paperwork than on how to actually engage all the kids who I ended up having on my caseload. And I ended up having to wear like a lot of safety equipment, learned a lot about field safety and things of that nature that really sent all the wrong messages about my true intentions for youth. But again, much of what I learned early on in my career and what I've learned over the arc of my career really reflects what I became aware of early on as a JPO. And that is simply that probation is used for everything. It tries to be everything to everyone. It's used to get the attention of youth who have first-time offenses. It's often misused to access services for youth and families with other social service needs. And it's an alternative to incarceration. Often the last chance for youth who have had a chronic history of delinquency. So quite frankly, probation is literally everywhere. Everywhere you turn in juvenile justice. So what I found on my actual caseload was I had a good many kids who didn't really need my time and attention, let alone probation at all. They were on probation because as a system, we've got to do something. And often I found myself only hoping that these youth didn't actually break probation rules so I didn't have to ding them for violations and potentially pull them deeper into the system. And I had a handful, maybe a dozen or so youth who I couldn't give enough or the right kind of attention. These were young people with serious and repeat offenses, many of whom actually had multiple treatment needs, and they also just needed basic supports and opportunities for youth development. They needed positive role models and mentors, healthy recreational outlets, and constructive activities. The fear of probation and court sanctions, having to go back in front of the judge, you know, the proverbial one last chance, was largely relied upon, but really just not effective. And so for me, I found that I had not enough time, training, support, or resources to really get my arms around the group of kids I was most concerned about. But all that being said, I found that my fondest moments as a probation officer, the most rewarding experiences, were the times when I could actually see a kid turn the corner and get on the right path. But that process was usually not easy. It usually involved taking some chances. It meant working through ups and downs with young people and their families, sometimes betting on my own relationship with the young person and their family, despite what my supervisor or my probation chief may be saying or recommending that I do. It meant being creative, accessing untapped resources, and forming new partnerships to provide additional supports to young people. So last thing I'll say is that over the arc of my career, I've seen the field really advance as well. And I've hopefully been a part of those advances that have taken place. Currently, I believe that most probation professionals know much more about the root causes of delinquency than they once did and have improved skills for interacting with young people. But my experience tells me, and I think the research suggests, as we'll show you, that without significant changes to the fundamental structure of community supervision, probation professionals will continue to struggle with the same conundrum that I've described before, which is running the risk of often pulling young people deeper into the system who shouldn't be in the system at all, and simply missing the mark with the youth on probation we're most concerned about. And these are the kids that we can least afford to get it wrong with. So in talking about the paper, and we'll shift to that, this is really my attempt to try to alleviate some of that tension that I described and make probation a much more meaningful experience. So the first thing we want to talk about is why transform juvenile probation. And as I started off talking about before, probation is everywhere. It's the most commonly used disposition that's used in juvenile courts. As you can see, 63% of all adjudicated youth are placed on probation, but even more striking are the 200,000 non-adjudicated youth who end up on probation caseloads each year. These are young people being supervised on informal probation caseloads, even more of those youth than those who are actually adjudicated. And as you can see, probation also is a gateway to incarceration in many cases and perpetuates disparities, with 68% of all young people who are in residential custody for violating probation being youth of color. And then lastly, what we know about probation is that the basic structure hasn't changed at all in several decades. That the basic structure of a young person being given a set of rules and conditions by a judge or a court official, then having those conditions monitored by an officer of the court or a probation officer, and then facing any range of sanctions from having curfew restricted to possible incarceration for not following those rules. That basic structure and a lot of related practices simply lag behind what we know about youth development. So one of the things we first sought to do in this paper was to establish a unified vision around probation, because we know that that's simply absent from the way it currently exists. What my experience tells me and what we've seen is that probation is practiced very differently from state to state, county to county, and in a lot of cases, even cubicle to cubicle. So we thought it was important to give some clear definition to who should be the appropriate population for probation, and that being young people who have serious and repeat offenses, who pose significant risk for serious reoffending, to define what those goals for probation should be, that of personal growth, positive behavior change, and long-term success. But most importantly, we wanted to propose a vision for probation that didn't just position probation officers as the primary lever for behavior change, but to really lean on and make core to probation practice partnering with families and communities to be part of this process, and to do so in a way that promotes racial and ethnic equity. In the paper, we really talk about two pillars of our vision. And the first is to just simply reduce the number of youth on probation by diverting far more young people from the system altogether. And then secondly, to refashion probation into something that's more strategic and targeted for the smaller number of youth who remain on caseloads. So what kind of drove us arriving at these two pillars? So the chart that you're looking at, you may be wondering, why am I looking at three flat lines? And I'll share with you that even as we proposed this actual chart for the probation paper, our communications department was asking, why are you showing a chart that shows nothing happening? But that's exactly the point, that this chart right here both shows a whole lot of things happening and very little going on all at the same time. That even when we look back to 1995, when juvenile arrest rates were reaching their peak, and we had scholars warning of the coming generation of juvenile super predators. And in the 20 years since, we've learned so much about youth development and about delinquency. We know which type of interventions actually do have an impact on reoffending. We know which youth populations we should target for those interventions. We know that diversion has shown very promising results and outcomes. And yet, despite all of that knowledge over the last 20 years, the utilization of diversion and probation has changed very little over that time. And that just seems like a real missing piece in our field in terms of moving the needle on that.
So Megan, this is gonna go to you. And one thing I just want to say, this is Nate again, but just is, I should have said at the beginning, Steve would be thrilled if you, interrupted him by waving your hand at Megan and saying, hey, I've got a question. This really, like I said at the beginning, this is aimed to be a discussion. So please, throughout, you can let the moderators know that you have questions, and we'll find ways to pipe those in.
Thanks, Nate. And we will launch this first poll now. We'd love to hear from you about the use of diversion in your jurisdiction. Right now in your community, what percentage of youth, would you guess, if you don't know the number off the top of your head, are diverted from formal case processing? So that poll should have popped up on your screen, and make sure you pick your choice and hit that submit button down at the bottom. And it looks like as the results are rolling in, we've got a pretty good mix, ranging from less than 20% all the way up to 61 to 80%. And while the poll is going,
speed for Virginia.
We've got a question. Can you define diversion, and does it include police arrest?
Is that a question?
Yes.
So that's a perfect segue for what we're talking about. Diversion, we would say, can happen at any of three stages. It can happen at the point of arrest, or not arresting. Police always have that discretion to do warnings, contact the family, and simply send the young person on their way, or to make a referral for that case to an appropriate program for diversion services. It can also happen at the level of prosecution. Prosecutors have a tremendous amount of discretion and latitude and can make decisions about which types of cases should be formally processed and filed. And then finally, I think the last kind of gatekeeper in that process is probation departments, still having the discretion once referrals hit juvenile intake to make decisions about how serious these cases are, what are the supports and strengths that young people and their families possess, and whether there's informal ways that they can handle it. So diversion can happen at any of these three areas.
And you'll see the results of that poll are up on the screen now, and a pretty big mix, highest levels between 20 and 60%, but responses across the board.
Okay, great. And so one of the things in describing the first pillar about diversion we wanted to do was we really want to draw some bright red lines in terms of what we mean by diversion and how that should be handled. And part of the reason for that is that we know that there's a tremendous amount of racial disparities that happen at the point of diversion. So we thought it was important to, again, draw some really bright red lines so that we make sure young people are receiving equitable treatment. So we wanted to be very clear about which types of offenses, low-level offenses, misdemeanors, nonviolent, first-time felonies that we believe could be most appropriately handled, and the research supports that outcomes are better for young people when they're diverted in these cases. We also wanted to make a significant shift and say that communities should lead diversion, that most delinquent acts that occur are better handled by communities, other human service agencies, and families. And so that responsibility should be shifted out of juvenile probation to reserve those resources. And finally, there should be no court consequences or refiling for noncompliance with diversion. We know from the research that most young people will age out of those delinquent behaviors with or without any intervention. So oftentimes it's just simply counterproductive to refile and bring young people deeper into the system for noncompliance with diversion. One of our probation transformation sites, Lucas County, Ohio, has really taken up this charge and really shown some promising practices with this. Through their Youth Assessment Center in Lucas County Juvenile Court, they started a misdemeanor services unit. They divert all their misdemeanor cases through the Youth Assessment Center. Youth are either diverted to a community-run diversion program, or they have a case manager who handles their cases in a much different way than normal probation supervision. And most importantly, these cases don't get refiled. They don't get kicked up to probation when they don't comply. What they found in Lucas County, quite frankly, is that you can close cases as unsuccessful for noncompliance, and the sky has not fallen in Toledo, Ohio. And so we're able to maintain public safety still. So now we're going to shift and talk about the second pillar, which is about probation. And as you can see, this is really about,
We're going to pursue this.
oh, we're going to do, okay. And so our next question is basically to kind of raise your hand if your diversion programs are run by community-based organizations rather than by probation or the courts. And as you're responding to that, I'll say that we probably wouldn't be surprised if many of you are raising your hands. We're anticipating that most jurisdictions do contract out diversion programs to community-based organizations. But what we're talking about is something that's much different. It's not simply having community-based organizations run a diversion program. It's really that diversion should live with community-based organizations. So that last idea we talked about of not refiling, that's really how we get to that. Because if police or prosecutors are referring cases to community-based organizations, that it never even hits the juvenile court. And that's, in my opinion, the best way that we ensure that those kids don't get pulled deeper into the system unnecessarily.
If anybody's wondering about how to raise your hand, down at the bottom of your screen in your navigation bar, there should be a hand icon that you can hit. And it looks like we've only got about 10% of folks raising their hands, but a few people in the chat box saying that they've got a blend of community-based organizations and and system-led diversion options.
Great. Okay, so as we're shifting to probation, next poll question we want to ask is just about average caseload size on probation. And you can see we have a pretty broad range there from less than 10 youth to more than 50. Those on the lesser end, I'm sure, will be the envy of some of your colleagues across the country that are, you know, in the 40 and up range.
That poll should be visible on your screen right now. Make your choice and hit submit. And as the votes are rolling in, a lot falling in that middle range, some as low as 11 to 20 or up to 31 to 40. But you're right, Steve, not many who are clicking on that 10 youth or less button.
Okay. So again, what we believe and we propose in the paper is that by diverting a far greater share of young people from the system altogether, it will have much smaller caseloads. We're suggesting caseloads of 8 to 12 youth. And again, thinking about the population that we're talking about, young people who have committed serious and repeat offenses, who do pose some risk to public safety. And so these smaller caseloads are really essential so that probation staff can form close, caring relationships with all youth on their caseload. As I described early on in my experience as a probation officer, I couldn't spend the type of time and energy with all the young people on my caseload that needed that attention. But we really want to create a scenario where every young person on supervision is able to form a close relationship with their probation officer so they really understand at an intimate level what the challenges and needs and strengths and supports are that they need. In doing this also, one of the things we really feel strongly about, and the research supports so convincingly, is that utilizing incentives and opportunities as opposed to sanctions and the threat of confinement is going to get us much better results with young people. All of the research on adolescent development clearly supports this, that young people are much more receptive to this. It's a better way to motivate them to both complete their probation goals and to move towards long-term success. And so one of the things that we want to challenge everyone to think about, because we talk about graduated responses, and we all know the ratio of 4 to 1, and that it's important. And we know that many places are starting to really get a better blend in terms of how do you utilize incentives, make those available for young people. But we're really talking about shifting that completely so that this incentives becomes a primary lever for motivating young people and getting their buy-in.
And I think, Steve, this is a great example of the kind of thing where what we're talking about in this piece is that one of the reasons why we're building off incentives is because we know it's out there. We know it's out there in the field, but I think incentives has typically been an add-on to the existing probation platform as opposed to itself being the way in which we motivate kids as a standard form of practice for all young people who end up on probation.
Yep, absolutely. The other thing that I would just want to point out as well is, to really think more broadly in how we work with young people and maximize the time and opportunities that we have with them. So incentives doesn't have to be something as simple as gift cards or cash rewards or things of that nature. Many of the young people, especially the population we're talking about, live in underserved neighborhoods where they don't have enough outlets for basic youth development needs like recreational activities, constructive activities to do, job, employment opportunities, things of that nature. So I think the challenge for us as probation systems is to really think about incentivizing youth and utilizing the types of rewards that we know will get them towards long-term success. So connecting them to role models, to positive activities, to popular activities that young people are really interested in doing and value and that are meaningful to them as a way to move them along the right path. So our next question around probation is just raise your hands if there are youth and out-of-home placement in your community due to technical violations. And I'm going to assume that there are almost all the hands going up. If there are not, I would definitely like to contact you to know what you're doing in your jurisdiction.
The hands are going up quickly on this one, Steve.
The hands are going up quickly, okay, as anticipated. So this is one of those big ideas that Nate kind of talked about at the start. that we're proposing in this paper. And again, not just throwing out ideas, we believe that the research points us in this direction, but we just have to make a sharp shift in our practice to really achieve that goal. We know from years of research the potential dangers of incarceration for young people and the impact that that has on long-term success. And we also know that many of the basic rules of probation just have no correlation to reoffending. And so, you know, we just have to end that practice altogether of confining young people for violations of probation. Lucas County, who we're showing here, again, is one site that is really nearing that zero mark of young people who are confined for violations of probation. You can see that since 2012, they went from about 30 young people confined for violations to in 2017, only 4 people. And we're going to challenge our friends in Lucas County to zero that out in the coming year. But the other thing I would really just point out is that in doing so, for Lucas County, it really meant a shift. This was not achieved just through probation officers alone. What they discovered is it really meant partnering with families, with community organizations, really kind of an all hands on deck approach to work with the most challenging young people in their communities, to keep them in the communities, even when they had missteps and setbacks and were still failing to comply with probation.
Steve, we have a question that came in about what are family navigators and how do you get those in your court? Can you say more?
Sure. Family Navigators is a program implemented in Lucas County, but they actually learned about the program in New York City. A program in the Bronx called Community Connections for Youth started this program. And basically what it is a peer-to-peer model for families. And so what they've done is contract out to the court in the Bronx, contracted out with Community Connections for Youth. And they have court-involved families who are either currently or formerly involved with the system themselves. And they basically just provide some peer support for families who are going through the system. We know oftentimes there's a lot of mistrust from families with systems. Oftentimes the lingo, the terminology, the court procedures can seem very overwhelming. So having some peer contact and peer support to help understand what's taking place. What should I expect at the next hearing? The probation officer said this, what does that mean? How do I, who do I talk to if I'm having issues or troubles or have questions? This was a peer support model that has been very effective in New York, and they found to be very beneficial to collaborating better with families in Lucas County.
So we got one, I think we have one more question before our question at the very end. So if probation officers, raise your hand, if probation officers in your community consistently offer rewards and incentives for positive behavior. Okay, how are we looking, Megan?
We have several hands going up here. We've got about 18 folks saying, yes, that's happening in their jurisdictions.
Okay, great. As we talked about, we know that as people are implementing graduated response grids in their jurisdictions, that hopefully incentives are part of that process. But again, as Nate and I talked about earlier, we're talking about a really sharp shift where incentives and incentivizing positive behavior really becomes the primary lever for motivating young people. Our other probation transformation site, Pierce County, has really taken this to task with what they call opportunity-based probation. You can see the grid on the screen that basically shows the point system they developed, where young people who comply with conditions of their probation receive points weekly and then can redeem those. I want to acknowledge Kevin Williams from Pierce County, who is the assistant court administrator over juvenile probation, who's on the line. And Kevin, if you're there, I welcome you to join in anytime and describe a little bit more about the fantastic work and innovations that you're implementing in Pierce County.
I don't know, Megan's got to let him, give him a mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can allow, Kevin, I'm going to hit the allow to talk button. So if you've got a mic on your computer, you can feel free to jump in if you'd like.
Is he there?
Okay. So if Kevin jumps in, he can jump in at any time. But again, oh, there he is.
Hey, all right. It's plugging in.
All right, Kevin, you there?
There might be a crowd in Pierce County.
Oh, okay. No, we can't hear him. Why don't you continue to brag about Pierce County and when he when
he chimes in, we'll keep going. Okay. So they have opportunity-based probation. The other program that we really like to brag about on Pierce County is their Pathways to Success program. And again, thinking about how we respond to young people who really have challenges while they're on probation, Pierce County has really implemented Pathways to Success with a laser focus on racial equity. So basically what they discovered when looking at their data is that the youth most in jeopardy for failing on probation and going into residential custody were African-American boys aged 15 and under. So they developed a wraparound approach where they use exactly that, a wraparound approach to make decisions about the young people and their cases, connecting them to peers, connecting them to positive development opportunities in the community as a way to better work with these young people and reduce the reliance on out-of-home placement.
So, because we want to make sure, if Kevin can chime in, it's great, but I want to make sure that we get to really people asking questions, but so we could even wait on our big reveal question at the end. I guess I jumped to it too soon, which was sort of like, have we motivated everyone enough to go there? But so I don't know if we want to go there now or we want to really just open it up because, again, we hope this is just the start of discussion with everyone here. But so, Megan, are there questions out there that we can get to?
We do, yeah. I've got a question from Avik that is,
great.
It's a long one, so I'm going to scroll down to get started here. That probation is presently the sentence of choice for any youth that would otherwise face sentencing to youth prison. What is the distinction between youth that state law says could be imprisoned for a crime and youth who would have committed serious and repeat offenses and pose a risk to public safety? I'm recognizing that the system currently believes it's doing youth a favor by avoiding prison and placing them on probation. Getting folks on board with the expansion of diversion is an easier lift relevant to getting folks to believe that something less than probation is warranted for youth who could be eligible for youth prison or out-of-home placement. So I'm really trying to get a sense of the two pillars, diverted youth and probation youth, and how these two pillars would cover youth who are eligible for prison.
Okay, if I'm understanding the question right, I believe Avik's asking about youth who typically would be confined and go to residential placement and how probation can be an effective alternative. And so I think, again, it's really just shifting resources and really just investing in what we know gets better results. And we know clearly that on the whole, young people have better outcomes and results when they remain in the community than when they go into residential care. But largely it's been hard to maximize that opportunity with young people in the community because, again, we use probation for far too many young people and we end up clogging up the system and probation caseloads with young people who could be diverted out of the system and the community resources altogether. So I think that really becomes the challenge. Again, I think that on the whole, in many ways, in terms of the individual skill level of probation officers, we made advances in the field. So this is really about shifting and being laser focused on how we utilize those resources. And for all of the time, training, and skill building that probation officers across the country are doing, those skills and resources are better utilized on the young people who we know present the greatest challenges and who are most in need of intervention. And to do so in a way that we know will get the best results, which is being in the community, being close to their families, being connected to positive adults in their communities, getting connected to positive organizations in their community. Ultimately, that's how we get at safety, is preparing young people for the long term, not just ensuring that they don't commit new offenses while they're on probation, but really setting them up for long-term success as adults.
Thanks, Steve. And we also have a question from Sheila. Can you speak to any experience you may have in knocking down systemic barriers to hiring credible messengers, mainly as it relates to the barriers with their criminal history being a barrier in their background checks?
So I do not have personal experience with that. And so this will be another plug for JDI Connect, because these are exactly the type of questions that we want everyone to pose to your colleagues all across the nation and share resources and share experiences. I know that Credible Messengers has shown some really promising results in New York City, and I'm sure that those are barriers that they've had to, and challenges they've had to deal with in terms of, the typical ways, if you have a criminal record that you can't work in justice systems. But with the Credible Messengers model, it's almost the opposite, that a lot of times adults who've been involved in the system, but who have gotten on the right path and are looking to contribute and give back to society can be the most effective messengers to young people. They understand their experiences. And it's really an untapped workforce that we really need to take a look at. But I have not had personal experience with that again. So I think that's a great question. I would, Sheila, that you asked, I would encourage you to reach out to the folks in New York, and I think it'd be a great question to post on JDI Connect to see what other experiences there are out there across the country.
Great. And our next question is, can you specify what exactly a risk to public safety regarding a youth who would be placed on probation would be, such as what specifically would be deemed a risk to public safety?
So this is an interesting question. As we talk about in a couple different ways, I think obviously looking at a young person's offending history, what's the chronicity in terms of their offending, could be one indicator. Certainly when we look at the level of offenses, and certainly offenses where, other people are harmed, where there are victims, and where they've done violent offenses is definitely a part of that. The reason I hesitate is because we also want to give word of caution, and you'll see in the paper that we provided a note to readers about risk assessment, because from my own personal experience, using risk assessments have been a good advance for the field. In terms of when I started in the system, we didn't have risk assessments and people were just kind of making judgment calls. So having some structured way to make decisions certainly is a better way to go. But we also know that there's emerging research that indicates that in many ways, the predictive analytics can perpetuate racial disparities, that there's a lot of indicators and factors that are inherent in risk assessment instruments that are going to work to the disadvantage of kids of color. Factors like age at first arrest, prior history, all of these things that may be just as dependent on the school they go to, the neighborhood they live in, how heavily that neighborhood's policed, as it is their behavior. So it's not a really simple answer for young people who pose a risk to public safety. I think certainly looking at their prior behaviors and current behaviors that bring them to the attention of the system, and certainly where there's violence involved and harm to other people are indicators. But all of this has to be balanced as well with what are the strengths and supports that are in place, so that we can utilize the least restrictive measures.
Thank you, Steve. And again, if anybody is interested in asking their question out loud, you can feel free to raise your hand. If you've got a microphone on your computer, I can open up your line and we can hear from you directly. And next question is, where do you recommend a jurisdiction get started if they want to go down the road that Pierce County have taken?
Well, this is Nate, and I'll start with one of the reasons we started with the vision was because it felt like this was just such a JDAI lesson that, all the people who are on this line today, if they've been part of a JDI site, the focus of having a purpose of detention conversation and knowing the power of doing that at the outset. I think one of the big question marks going into this, and if you read the full paper, one of the critiques we made actually of probation reform efforts that have happened to date that have a lot of really good things about them in the carry guides and the RFK process and epics that are about how probation officers work with young people, that has really good stuff in them. What they don't get at is like the big picture, which is, why are we doing this at all? What's the purpose of probation? Who is the population we should be targeting in the first place? How is it that we work with families and communities? And so I hope it doesn't sound like a cop-out to start with the big picture, but it seems like everything else feels like piecemeal changes if we're not aligned about what are we even doing here. And just because to reinforce this for all the probation folks who are on the phone, from our perspective, when we're looking at why we want to change probation, is often not about what probation officers themselves are doing. It's about how all the other people in the juvenile justice system see probation, and how that goes in 8 different directions, from judge to judge, from prosecutor to prosecutor, and so forth. And so the idea of having a common vision around what's the point of probation just seems like a natural place to begin. And from there, and with using the data, I think it'll really tell you where to start. If you're, as we saw some people raising their hand and said they're diverting 20% of cases, then honestly, I would hope that you'd start with diversion. Because if you try to transform probation, but with caseloads where everyone's on probation, then it's going to be a problem. But if you're already at a point where you're diverting 60, 70% of the kids, then diversion probably isn't the place you're going to start from, and you're going to start somewhere else.
Thank you very much. Oh, we have another longer question coming in. It says, in this transformation vision, 60% of youth will be diverted, leaving 40% on probation, and that's a question. Does that mean it's 40% youth who have committed serious and repeat offenses and pose a risk to public safety? And the person is saying, I guess I'm thinking in our house that in a world where 60% or more of youth are diverted and the remaining are adjudicated, they may not all be youth who have committed serious or repeat offenses.
So I'll jump, like 60% was simply a floor and simply a guidepost as something to say, if we look at national data about who are the kids in the system, that at the very least, that's where you should be. We know that there are sites within JDI who are diverting more than 60% of the kids. Not just because people raised their hand today in the webinar. So that's a great question. I think like everything else, the data in your jurisdiction should drive this. When we put out a number, it's always the danger of putting out any kind of number, say 60%, because we don't want anyone aiming for 60%. I think what we would say is, if you're diverting less than that, really scrutinizing the data to understand why, because everything we see from place to place would tell us that 60% should be a good benchmark for a starting point, but not necessarily where you would end up. And if what you're seeing is, if 80% or 90% of the cases that come to your front door are misdemeanors, then at the very least, that's exactly what we'd be saying should be your benchmark for what you're aiming for. That's a great question.
And Avik says, he affirms your observation, Native. What's the point of probation in that situation?
Yes. Thanks, Avik.
And a question around diversion and equity, that we've seen situations where increasing diversion has led to an increase in the diversion of white youth and exacerbated issues of equity in the system. And so what is your advice as folks are expanding diversion to keep that from happening?
So 2 things. I think this is exactly why, as I referred to bright red lines, we tried to draw that distinction, because we know that oftentimes it's a judgment call, and youth of color come into the system with misdemeanors, they're assessed, and quite frankly, some of the factors that I talked about, even in risk assessment instruments, will work to their disadvantage. They score high on things like leisure and recreation or antisocial attitude, and these are the things that push them into probation as opposed to having those opportunities for diversion. So in drawing some clear distinctions at a charge level, hopefully that balances the scales a little bit and will ensure that youth of color get those equal opportunities. And then also a huge part of that is, again, letting diversion live within communities, that young people who commit low-level offenses, in most cases, they're going to age out of these behaviors anyway. It's much more symptomatic of the typical adolescent behavior that we've all either observed, I will say with some sarcasm, or been involved with ourselves. And so communities, families, and organizations, human service agencies within the community are more appropriately situated to deal with those situations. We shouldn't be exercising the resources of the court and putting young people at risk of deeper system involvement.
Thanks. And we don't have any other questions in the box right now, so would it be a good time for us to pull up that last poll question?
All right, well, give us a second.
Okay, I can do it from my end too if you'd like.
Oh, okay.
All right, so we will.
Go ahead.
Okay. So now that we've had this conversation, we're interested in hearing from you all. Is this something that you're ready for at this point? Is your community ready to transform probation? So we have a few different options that will pop up on your screen. Yes, you have commitment, your momentum, you're ready to go. You know you need to make a change, but you're willing to take some steps, or you're a little bit more cautious, might have some concerns. Or maybe you still need to read the paper, think about it for a couple weeks, and get back to us. And so far, we have a lot of folks falling in the middle of knowing they need to make a change and ready to take some steps, about half of our respondents. And about 25% who are saying, yes, we are ready to go. And still
Steve, give me your phone number.
Okay.
Steve, phone numbers at the end of the presentation.
Yes. If you're in the yes category, give me a call.
So it looks like a lot of folks who are in that position of being ready to move forward, and some who have some more need for conversation about their concerns, and we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, and as Nate said at the start, this is exactly why we wanted to do this webinar, why we want to continue the conversations on JDAI Connect and in other settings and forums, because we know that a lot of folks fall in the, well, we're interested, that sounds good, but we have concerns. We tried to really follow the trail of the research, and the research pointed us in directions that we know are going to be challenging. It pushes against some conventional wisdom, against traditional practices, against maybe in some cases our basic instincts about things like, incentives. What are we paying kids to do what they're supposed to do? But we're saying, like, yeah, you should do it. Because, like, I have teenage sons and I bribe them all the time to try to get them to do what I want them to do. So, I mean, it's these type of things that we just have to have a much clearer sense of and be willing to lean forward and modernize our system. The last point I would say on that is it's an ideal time to do it. Working in a place of crisis is no way to make changes. And we're at a point in our system where we have record low juvenile arrest rates, incarceration, be it in residential placement or detention. The system in a lot of ways has made a lot of advances. And so this is really an opportunity to push it to the next level and really modernize our system, take the most advantage of what we know about youth development, and really have an opportunity to get it right with a lot of the young people who typically fall through the cracks.
Great. And we have a question from Joseph Thomas, who's raised his hand. So I'm going to hit the allow to talk, Joseph, and hopefully you'll be able to hop on and ask your question. Oh, but it looks like Joseph, you may need to turn your microphone on. And while we're waiting for his question to pop up, I will mention that this is going to be just the first of several conversations we're hoping to have, but the next opportunity, once folks have had some time to dive into the paper and give some more thought to their ideas and concerns, is going to be a town hall style meeting with Steve in 2 weeks on May 31st. So registration for that is going to be open on JDI Connect. And that will be an open meeting. Everybody will have the opportunity to speak, ask their questions, and also if you have questions in advance, to post them in JDI Connect so we can make sure that we're prepared for them. So I hope that we'll see a lot of you back for that conversation. And it looks like Joseph may not have a microphone that can be activated. So feel free to put that question in the chat box, Joseph, if you'd like us to get it to you today. And also we will continue this conversation on JDI Connect. Oh, there he is. Hello, Joseph, go ahead.
Yes, we are, I borrowed a lot of things from the JDI website. We started an after hours program to help divert a lot of kids from going into detention. And we actually have a new administrator who came from Arizona, and so he talks about a lot of things that have been done over there. One of the, I guess, concerns that he raised with me, if I started to open up this can here and pursue it more aggressively, is that some of the counties that have utilized or gone forth with the JGI principles, when they've gotten to a certain point, the sustainability hasn't always been there. And so I don't know if, as an organization, if more is being done on the back end, as far as it seems like there's a lot of information, a lot of energy about plugging different tools and techniques. But as we know, this is a big effort by the entire community. What has been, or is there more information about how to sustain these principles after you get the assistance from, say, JDI?
So that's a great question. And Joseph, in some ways, not to pun on it, but it feels like it's a whole other webinar that we should be having about sustainability within JDI, and it's one of the three core priorities that we've talked about over the last couple of years. I imagine there are a number of people on the phone who would themselves be really great resources for how they've sustained JDI, either at a local level or at a state level. In fact, Megan, I really encourage how we do this, just because I know we're going to be short on time, also of just making sure we actually start a conversation in JDI Connect about sustainability. But it goes back to a lot of the pieces that we that are part of the core strategies of JDI in terms of collaboration itself, about continuing to follow the core strategies over time, with everything from looking at data to revisit purposes of detention, to look at how we're using our tools to constantly see, like, where are we sort of coming up short, and where are we really having success. But Joseph, I think it's a great question. I didn't catch where you were from, Joseph. Where are you from?
I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Oh, Kalamazoo, Michigan. Okay. So I think once you get started, so this is great. We have a non-JDI site on the phone. But I think once people get started, I think we have a great set of people who could really talk about how how it is they've been able to sustain progress over time, and where they've had most success. Because as we've seen, there's some areas where we see success that maintains over time, and others where it's harder to sustain success, especially as the population narrows in areas like, for example, expediting case processing, which is why we've been really focusing on that over the last year. Thanks for the question, Joseph.
Thank you.
All right. And we've got a couple more questions in the chat box in our last few minutes. The first is about whether Casey has a recommended risk assessment tool to determine risk level, because I am concerned that kids of color are being rated as high.
Oh my goodness. You want to go?
So yeah, we can maybe tag team on this, but so no, we do not have a recommended risk assessment tool. Again, and I'm sure referencing, the note on risk that we included in the paper. And I would just echo that we just caution everyone to not simply take risk assessments and their predictive ability at face value, but really understand what underlies that predictive ability, which is oftentimes factors that may work to the disadvantage of young people. So, what we would suggest and recommend is that, as Nate said, you just continue to look at the numbers, figure out where you're coming up short, or where you may not be reaching young people in the way that you want to. Make sure that risk assessment tools are being utilized more than just for their predictive ability, but also, are they ensuring equity? Do they have utility? What type of decisions are they helping you make? So for instance, leisure activities. If a lot of young people who are in underserved communities are coming up high on leisure and recreation, it's one thing to assign them points on a risk assessment, but most important is, what are you doing to fill those gaps and address those needs? Are you investing in community partnerships? Because quite frankly, as Nate talked about, EPICS, the cognitive behavioral approaches, are all really sound approaches, but they only will go so far if young people don't have positive alternatives to do instead of the negative behaviors. And then that's where you really have to kind of fill the gaps. So that, not to kind of hedge on that, again, we simply don't have a risk assessment tool we would recommend. And we know that there's value in them, but it's not the whole ball game, and just have to really look at the data and see if it's impacting youth of color in a disproportionate way.
And I think one of the things is just that, and I'm taking some liberties and assuming we're talking about like a dispositional risk assessment instrument. And again, the process is at least as important as the tool that's being used about determining what is the value of the screening tool, the risk instrument, how are we using it along with other things. And I think when Steve was pointing out the Pierce County example, this is where we typically see it fall short, that if we see that there are a particular group of young people, in this case, Black young men 15 and under, who are exactly the ones who are re-offending, who keep getting rearrested at least, and coming back to the in front of the system, which would typically give them a label of high risk and therefore placement, that their approach is the opposite, which is to say, if these are the kids that we are failing with because they keep coming back to the system, then our job is to give them our best, not give them our worst. And I think that a full conversation about all of this requires that we look at all of that both how are the ways in which tools are showing up as having bias within them. They can be valid and they cannot be equitable at the same time. And that's a real challenge in our space, and one which we should have many future conversations with, because we know that most of you are now using some kind of dispositional risk assessment instrument, and that all of them have challenges one way or another. But if equity is front and center as part of the goal, then it can't be enough to look at it and say, well, the high risk kids are the ones who are coming from these neighborhoods. That must mean there's something about those kids. And I think that this is a longer term issue that's connected to it. We addressed it only in this one page text box in the paper because it's a whole other report in and of itself, but it's one that we also think is critical for the field going forward. You
got an amen to that one, Nate.
Thank you. Amen.
And one last question. Our community is interested in the idea of positive opportunity-based, incentive-based probation. And of course, we hear the concerns about public safety, but primarily it sounds like concerns are financial. So do you have any advice to offer on jurisdictions that have concerns about the cost of making this kinds of transition?
Yeah, that's an area we still have to really build out. Because we know that that's a challenge in many places. There's not a lot of public funding available for these type of things. Most of the public funding is usually dedicated for more like treatment type services, and not for helping fund community organizations or for positive youth development activities. So it is an area that we are looking at very closely and seriously, and want to work, and are eager to work with jurisdictions and helping to build that out and make the case to legislators and policymakers to show that incentives work better than sanctions, that young people, giving them opportunities in the community is a better investment than reserving dollars for when they fail and end up in out-of-home placement. So we're anxious and eager to work with jurisdictions. I know it's different from state to state. Right. Some states have a lot more flexibility in terms of state funding streams, where you can ask for different types of dollars and use them in very flexible, discretionary ways. Would say you should kind of tap into those and see what are the limits that you can push and exercise in some of those funds, because the research is very clear that that's going to get us better outcomes. We just have to make the case and develop the funding streams for it.
And knowing that, I think, again, like in the piece, again, with the intent that there would be debate and discussion, but part of the point of the vision, if we went back to it, we don't have to go back to this slide, but part of what we're trying to emphasize is this type of vision of working more closely with both the right kids for probation, and then probation officers working in partnership with families and with community, is the means to public safety. It's not do that and then have this other thing that's about public safety, which looks like electronic monitoring and drug screening and those things. And so I think I would challenge, knowing, as Steve said, it's very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction how funding is arranged, but knowing that all of our sites are spending money on some kind of service, whether it's electronic monitoring, whether it's on drug screening, whether it's on drug substance abuse therapy, like there's lots of things that are out there, and prioritizing those things versus what we know actually motivates young people to change, which is, again, asserting as the point of helping young people grow. It takes prioritization, and we're making a case for why that prioritization ought to live towards things like incentives and opportunities for young people. But we know that it's going to be really difficult and different from place to place.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our webcast today. Nate and Steve, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts, and to everybody for all of the questions that you posed. And again, we hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation that will continue in JDI Connect. And up in JDI Connect now is also the registration for the May 31st Town Hall with Steve, which will be an opportunity to really dive into some more in-depth questions on the topic. And we have links to the paper, to the infographic, and a lot of related resources that are on JDI Connect right now. There's links from the slider on the homepage for anybody that's looking for those. And thanks again, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.